In this video, we're going to be using the given zero to write a polynomial as a product of linear factors. And this is going to be real zeros, so no complex zeros, no I. Okay, so recall that if c is a zero, then x minus c is a factor. Okay, also remember that when you're using synthetic division, you're going to use the zero. Okay, you're going to use the zero as the number outside of the box. If you're ever given it in factored form like this, you need to change the sign of whatever this number is. But if you're given the zero, just use that zero. Okay, so we're going to use synthetic division with the given zero, and then it's going to take this cubic function down to a quadratic function, and we'll either have to factor it or use the quadratic formula. But either way, we're going to have to write it in linear factors. Okay, so let's begin. We have this function, x cubed minus 7x minus 6, and our zero is negative 2. So I'm going to put a negative 2 here outside of the house. Notice that I am missing an x squared term. So I have x cubed, no x squared term, I have an x term, and then I have a number. Okay, so I'll put a 0 in place of that. So here's for the x cubed, a 1, and a 0 for the x squared, a negative 7 for the x, and a negative 6 for that constant at the end. Okay, I'm going to drop down that first one and then start. Multiply, that's negative 2. Add down and you get negative 2. Multiply and you get 4. Add down and you get negative 3. Multiply and you get 6. And add down and your remainder is 0, which it needed to be 0 because it said this was a 0. So when we plug it in, it should give us 0 as an answer. Okay, so we take our cubic and knock it down by one exponent. So this is going to be an x squared term. This is going to be an x term, and this is going to be our constant now. Okay, so our new function, our quadratic, is 1x squared, or just x squared, minus 2x minus 3. Okay, so that's our new quadratic, and now we need to figure out how to either factor this, and if we can't factor it, we'll use the quadratic formula. So to factor this, we look at the negative 3 and the 1 that's in front of here. We multiply them together. So the 1 is the number in front of here times the negative 3 is just negative 3. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to get to negative 3, but also add to get negative 2. So those two numbers are negative 3 and positive 1. If you multiply these two together, you get negative 3. If you add these two numbers together, you get negative 2. So those are the factors. So you can write it in factored form now. It would be x minus 3 and x plus 1. Okay, and that gives us two of our factors. The other one is going to come from the given 0. Remember, if you're given a 0, you change the sign to put it in factored form. Okay, so we're given negative 2 as a 0. That means that x plus 2, change the sign, is our factor. So h of x in factored form is equal to x plus 2, and then the factors we got here, x minus 3 and x plus 1. Okay, let's try another one. Okay, this time I have this function, x cubed plus 2x squared minus 9x minus 18. I'm given that negative 3 is a 0, which recall that means that x plus 3 is a factor. Okay, so you change the sign to put it in factored form. Okay, so now we need to figure out the other one. So we're given negative 3 is a 0, so that's the number I'm going to put out in front of the synthetic division house. And now I make sure I'm not missing any terms. I have x cubed, I have x squared, I have x to the 1, and I have my number, so they're all in order and none's missing. So now I just put the coefficients down here. So the x cubed has a coefficient of 1. The x squared has a coefficient of 2. The x has a negative 9, and then the number is 18, negative 18. Okay, so I am going to start by dropping down this 1 and then multiply, get negative 3. Add, you get negative 1. Multiply, you get 3. Add, you get negative 6. Multiply, you get 18. Add, you get 0, which needs to happen since it said it is a 0. Okay, so our new quadratic, if we take this down by one exponent, this would be our x squared term. So 1x squared minus 1x, or just x, minus x, and then minus 6. Okay, so this is what we need to try to factor. Okay, so we try to factor this. 1 times negative 6 is negative 6. We want to find two things that multiply to get negative 6, but add to get this middle number. And there's no number here, so it's a 1, right? So negative 1. Okay, so that would be negative 3 and positive 2. If you multiply those, you get negative 6. If you add them, you get negative 1. So this factors into x minus 3 and x plus 2. That comes from right here. Okay, and then the one we already had was x plus 3. Okay, and then that's it. Okay, let's try a couple more. These are going to be a little more challenging. We're going to have to use a quadratic formula on these. Okay, so here we go. Got our new problem here. Negative 3 is a 0, which means x plus 3 is a factor. Okay, so our 0 is negative 3. Let's put that out here. X cubed, x squared, x, and a number. There's no terms missing. So 1, 5, 5, negative 3. Okay, drop down your first term. Multiply, you get negative 3. Add, you get 2. Multiply, you get negative 6. Add, you get negative 1. Multiply, you get 3. And add, you get 0 as expected. Okay, so our new quadratic is x squared, 1x squared, or just x squared, plus 2x minus 1. Okay, so let's try to factor this. We need two numbers that multiply to get negative 1 that add to get positive 2. Okay, think about that for a minute. You realize it's not possible. You cannot do that. There's no numbers that fit that criteria. So we have to use the quadratic formula. So for the quadratic formula, we need our a, b, and c. So our a is the number in front of x squared, that's a 1. Our b is the number in front of x, which is a 2. And our c is the number, the last number, which is negative 1. Okay, so those are the numbers we're going to use for the quadratic formula. Okay, so here's the quadratic formula. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so now we're just going to input the numbers in the correct place. Everywhere I see an a, I'll put this. Everywhere I see a b, I'll put this. And everywhere I see a c, I'll put this. Okay, so x is equal to negative b, so negative 2. The negative came from the formula. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 2 squared, minus 4 times a, it's 1, times c, negative 1, all over 2 times a, which is 1. Okay, we got the numbers in. Now we need to clean it up. So we can bring this negative to this 2 and drop the parentheses. So x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root. This is 4. And if I multiply negative 4 times this stuff, it's also 4. So this is 4, and this will turn into a positive 4. And 4 plus 4 is 8. And on bottom, 2 times 1 is 2. Okay? We need to reduce this square root. We reduce it by factoring out a 4. Okay, so that's square root. And let me write it over here off to the side. That's square root of 8. We know that 4 divides into it, and 4 is a square number. 4 goes into it twice, right? So we can take the square root of the 4, but we can leave the square root of the 2 alone. Square root of 4 is 2. So this becomes 2 on the outside, and that 2 stays on the inside. Okay, so back to the problem. We've got x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus this now instead of the 8. 2 square roots of 2. Okay, and I'm going to split the 2 up that's on the denominator to be under both. I want to divide them separately. Okay, so when I do that in my next step, I'll notice that negative 2 divided by positive 2 is negative 1. Plus or minus, these 2's cancel out. You can't cancel the 2 that's underneath the square root because it's underneath the square root. Okay, this is not 2. This is the square root of 2. Okay, but you can cancel these two. Okay, so that leaves the square root of 2, which gives you two answers: -1 plus the square root of 2 and -1 minus the square root of 2. Okay, those are your other two zeros. Okay, and remember, when you have a 0, if c is a 0, then x minus c is a factor. Okay, so we need to put x minus this and x minus this as our factors. Okay, so g of x is equal to, our original factor was x plus 3. That was given because they gave us the 0. Okay, and then we can go back up there and look at that. Okay, and then we have our first one, which is x minus, I'm going to put a parentheses there, and then I'm going to do an x minus and another little parentheses here. Okay, and inside each one of these parentheses, notice they both say x minus the 0 and then x minus the 0 right here. I'm going to put these answers, one each in both, okay, or one of each. Okay, so -1 plus the square root of 2, and then this one, -1 minus the square root of 2. And that is your answer. Okay, so you have x plus 3 is one of your factors, x minus this thing is one of our factors, and x minus this thing is one of our factors. Okay, and if you want to go ahead and distribute the negative sign, you can, but this answer is usually acceptable. Let's do one more. Okay, last example here. We've got 3 is a 0, which means x minus 3 is a factor. Okay, and then we put the 3 out front of the house and put our coefficients, make sure there's no missing terms. There's not, and they're in order, descending order. So 1 for the x cubed, 1 for the x squared, -11 for the x, and -3. Drop down that first one and then start. 3 times 1 is 3. Add these, you get 4. 3 times 4 is 12. Add these, you get 1. 3 times 1 is 3. Add these, you get 0 as expected. So remember, we knocked down the exponent by 1, so this will be our x squared, our x, and our number. So 1x squared, so just x squared, plus 4x plus 1. Okay, so we need to figure out what the factors are of that. See if we can factor it. Two numbers that multiply to get 1 but add to get 4, not going to happen. Okay, so again, quadratic formula. So we've got our a is equal to 1, our b is equal to 4, and our c is equal to 1. Okay, and here's a quadratic formula again real quick. Write it out kind of fast this time. Okay, so we put the numbers in the right place and then reduce. So x is equal to, let's write it over here, x is equal to negative b, so -4 plus or minus square root of b squared, so 4 squared, minus 4 times a times c, so that's a is 1 and c is 1, all divided by 2 times a, so 2 times 1. Okay, let's clean that up. We can drop the parentheses on this 4 here, make it a -4 plus or minus square root of, let's see, this is 16, it's 4 squared, and then minus 4. Okay, and then on top, or on bottom, we get 2. Okay, and then of course that becomes -4 plus or minus the square root of 12 over 2. Okay, and again, let's reduce that square root. I'll do it off to the side over here. So we got the square root of 12. It's divisible by 4, which is a square number. So it's 4 times 3. 4 times 3 gives us 12. And we can take the square root of 4 and leave the square root of 3 alone. Square root of 4 is 2. So on the outside we have a 2, and on the inside we have a 3. Okay, so this would become -4 plus or minus 2 square roots of 3. And I'll put the 2 just like last time, because again, I want to reduce. I'll put that denominator under each fraction separately instead of one big fraction. Okay, and then I reduce it. Okay, so this becomes -2 plus or minus, these cancel, square root of 3. So you get negative 2 plus square root of 3 and negative 2 minus the square root of 3. Those are our two zeros. Okay? So we do exactly what we did last time. I'm going to write h of x. I'm going to put our first factor that was given because we were given the 0. So we have x minus 3 as our first factor. Okay? And then I put x minus this parentheses and x minus this parentheses. And inside these parentheses, I'm going to put my two zeros that I found. So the first one is negative 2 plus the square root of 3. And the next one is negative 2 minus the square root of 3. And that is done.